He'd arrived early at the restaurant and wanted to have a drink and think through his lines. He thought the latest one sounded interesting, not the type he would normally have expected to answer such a rank cheese advert. The woman he'd spoken to on the phone sounded educated, and her description seemed to suggest someone a bit younger than his normal dates. Grace. What a lovely name, he mused. He'd only had one other Grace, an unhappy widow who he'd actually found quite disgusting. However, she'd not only been loaded, but couldn't wait to give him the money for his fictitious mother's cancer treatment in the States. She'd been convinced after their third wonderful date that McNally, or Tony as she knew him, was the man of her dreams. In fact, she wished she'd met him before her bastard of a late husband, whose only redeeming feature had been his considerable wealth. McNally had already arranged to get a prostitute he'd been with the previous evening to call him during tonight's dinner and make it sound like an important business call from New York. He knew from tried and tested experience that kind of thing always worked a treat and was normally a sound investment. The problem for McNally that night was that about a week earlier he'd been with another rather attractive hooker just after he'd arrived in Edinburgh. He wasn't to know that she was a registered Covert Human Intelligence Source, or CHIS as they were known in the modern and politically correct police force. Another thing he couldn't know was that she was an avid follower of Crime Watch, and the blurred shape of the Italian stallion, as the Mail loved to describe him, was enough for her to recognize her client even with his clothes off. Right on the time they'd agreed to meet, the doors opened and a woman wearing a light raincoat appeared. McNally was just a bit more excited than usual and prayed to the god of fraudsters that she was in fact his date. Her hair was cut short, almost boyish, and her sharp, clean features were definitely a break away from his usual clientele. He watched her speaking to the waiter, who pointed towards his table. She looked round, smiled in his direction, and he became even more excited, because she was certainly over a decade younger than the women who tended to answer his adverts. As she approached the table, he smiled across the room and tried to give her the look that he always thought had a bit of Colin Firth in it. As the coat dropped from her shoulders, the smile stalled, because unless he was very much mistaken, the woman either had some kind of abnormality, or she was well and truly pregnant, and very much nearer to birth than conception. "Fuck that," he said quietly, but it was loud enough for the couple to his left to look round, and the guy gave him a full glare. They shook their heads in concert and went back to their meal. McNally liked the look of this one, but pregnancy was a deal-breaker, so he decided that as soon as he could make an exit, he'd slope off to the toilets, then off-ski, and leave her with the bill. "Hi, you must be Tony." She stuck out a pale hand as he struggled to keep his cool and sense of frustration under control. He knew she could have been perfect for him, a real distraction after the acres of wrinkled or Botoxed flesh he often had to endure to make a buck. He stood up and took her hand. It was cool and soft. He stared into her green eyes, which even in the half-light of the restaurant seemed to glint with energy. Her smile suggested someone who was in control, even though it was him planning a quick escape. He was fascinated even though he hadn't spoken to her, bar the crap he'd given her on the phone. He wondered why this woman had answered his advert. There was a tingling along his spine as a thin bead of sweat ran its way down the small of his back and was absorbed by the elastic of his lucky red boxers. "It's nice to meet you, Grace. You look wonderful." He decided at that point to avoid her very obvious signs of pregnancy as the circuits in his brain tried to make sense of what he was seeing. There was a very slight tremor in his voice, which was unusual for a man who normally oozed confidence with his victims, vital where control was key to unlocking their bank accounts. "I've been dying to meet you, Hugh. Or do you prefer that I call you Elvis? Don't know many people with the name Elvis." She paused. "Apart from Elvis." The bead of sweat that had run down his back had turned into a stream. The sound of his real name put him on the edge of panic. Part of him said that she had to be a busy, but the woman sitting opposite him was pregnant and super tidy.